Harry, we begin this series of discussions on one of the beloved letters of Paul, really. No one doubts that Paul wrote this one among the letters attributed to him. This is the letter to the Philippians. Can you help us understand a little bit of the circumstances in which Paul wrote this letter and the kind of letter it is?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, on the kind of letter it is, it has a kind of bumpy feel to it. Let's put it that way. There's almost what seems to be a conclusion at the beginning of chapter 3.
Yeah.
Finally,
my
brothers and sisters, rejoice, he says.
It's that thing when the preacher says finally, and you hope to heaven he or she means it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so you think that Paul is pretty much getting ready to sign off, and then he goes on for a couple of other chapters. So some people have suspected that what we have here is not a single letter, but parts of two letters that were probably stitched together by the editorial team who pulled Paul's letters together in the first place.
Right.
Something similar to what probably happened with 2 Corinthians. Yeah. And there's also another little feature in here. There's an address to a single individual in chapter 4. And we'll talk about that in a little bit.
All right, good.
But it's in the middle of a context where Paul is addressing the community. And so it sort of sits there oddly. Is that coming from another letter, or is Paul somehow addressing
so
something?
suddenly singular
right.
audience. Yeah.
So there are some questions about, as the scholars say, the integrity of the letter. But there are also interesting overlaps and continuities between the two big sections of the letter. So another hypothesis that some people have put forward is that Paul might have written this over time. And then what we have is part one done on day one. He gets interrupted and then comes back to it the next day. Possible, but I think we have to recognize that there's a little unevenness in the letter. Paul is writing to the Philippians. Philippi is a community in the northern part of what is now Greece. It was a city founded by the Macedonians, by Philip II, king of Macedon, several centuries before Paul went there. He went there when he first started his missionary activity, according to Acts, a so-called second missionary journey, and it was one of the early places that he visited. And it was a city that was refounded as a Roman colony in the first century B.C. after the Battle of Actium, which was not far away. No, the Battle of Philippi, which was not far away. So it probably had a very Roman feel to it. Greek speakers, but very much part of the Roman Empire. Yeah. And who's in charge of things overall is a kind of big issue. And we'll come back to that when we talk about chapter 2.
Good.
So what Paul is doing in this letter, it's not a big doctrinal expose as Romans is to a certain extent. It's not dealing with a number of little pastoral issues as 1 Corinthians is, pastoral issues that have significant implications for what Christian community ought to be. It's not dealing with a polemical issue like he is in Galatians. Yeah. There are a couple of things that are going on. One, he's giving some thanks because apparently the Philippians have sent him a gift.
Right.
And why does he need a gift? He's in prison.
Yeah, exactly, right.
This is one of the so-called prison epistles of Paul. And one of the big questions about these prison epistles is whether they're all written from the same place at the same time.
Yeah.
And if so, what is that place and time? We know from Acts that Paul was in prison in Rome. Might have been house arrest, but he could have classified it as prison. At the latter stages of his career and somewhere in the early 60s. Yeah. But he talks about being in prison in places like 2 Corinthians.
He does.
So he probably had some jail time experiences when he was involved in his missionary activity in the Aegean. My own hunch is that Philippians is written from one of those prison experiences.
Earlier.
Yeah, probably in Ephesus. And he's writing to a place that he visited on his previous missionary journey a couple of years before. So I tend to think it was written sometime in the mid to late 50s to these Philippians, whether it's one or two letters. So that's the general shape of things. And Paul is giving thanks for support. He's also urging the Philippians to play nice. Apparently there's at least some little discord in the community caused by personality disagreements, it would seem.
So,
There doesn't seem to be a big,
does seem to be.
does not seem to be a big doctrinal issue at stake, but two women who are playing leadership roles, and that's interesting for thinking about the development of Christian
Absolutely.
communities at the time.
Absolutely.
He gives us their names in chapter 4, verse 2, Euodia and Syntyche. And they apparently are not getting along, and that's where Paul makes an appeal to someone else to help out with them and help them see eye to eye. That's one of the points of continuity, I guess, between the first letter and the first half and the second half of the letter.
Right.
Because having the mind of Christ is sort of at the heart of his exhortation in the first letter. And telling people, thank you for your support, but also try to get along well is something that he's saying in the second. That's the overall shape of this
very
letter.
Good. Very helpful.
Maybe you can say something about what's going on in the Thanksgiving section, which comes right after the greetings.
Typically when Paul has finished his greetings, he includes a large paragraph on what he's thankful for. And what he's thankful for says something both about what's on his heart in gratitude and what's on his mind in terms of hoping things will continue or improve. And I think, I haven't gone through it all again recently, but this Thanksgiving in verses 3 to 11 of chapter 1 of Philippians is perhaps the most thoroughly thankful, grateful, friendly, I love you very much. They're his partners in the gospel. They're not fighting the gospel. They're not even so much as children needing instruction at this point. They are co-workers with him in the gospel. And his prayer for them is not so much of correction, but of increase. That what you're doing is well, do it even better, so that your faithfulness may be more knowledgeable, that your care for one another may include more moral insight. Do what you're doing, only do it somewhat better because you're on the right track. And then along with that, there is the claim which is so clearly often there in Paul, which is that he and the Philippians both live their lives in the light of the coming day of Christ, and that they are to become more faithful, more loving, more careful, because that will be the gift they present when Christ comes in his glory at the very end of that Thanksgiving, his prayer that they might be blameless. So I think in that sense, this is a prayer of partnership, a prayer of friendship, and a prayer of the kind of exhortation that you should go from more to more, not from doing badly to doing well.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's a lot of goodwill and good feeling going on here between Paul and his addressees. There are also some other people out there that he's not particularly.
Well, there are.
About.
There's somebody.
What's going on there?
Yeah, some people who are somehow proclaiming Christ out of rivalry. There's something about opponents in here as well, and unlike something like the book of Galatians, or even I think 2 Corinthians, it's awfully hard to kind of spell out what this is about. It's not exactly the way Paul wants to preach the gospel. Is it about his authority? Is it about the content of the gospel? But in any case, we may have some hints later, but at least so far we can say, all right, these are people he thinks are not on his team in the same way, and he wards against following them too carefully.
Yeah, but he does sort of admit that they're proclaiming Christ.
Yeah, he
somehow,
does admit they're proclaiming Christ. It's a nice moment, which I just throw it out of total left field. But some years ago, there was a book written about Paul Tillich by a very strong Bartian. And he wrote to Karl Barth asking what he thought about Tillich's writing. And Tillich quoted this thing, which is,
what does it matter?
What does it matter that they proclaim Christ? But of course, the first part was some do it out of envy and stupidity. Mm-hmm. I think that was his word about Tillich, and then he went on to say, but nonetheless, it is the gospel. I will grudgingly admit that. So I think Paul grudgingly admits these are real Christian preachers.
Now, Paul also talks about kind of his angst toward the end of this chapter, right? For to me, living is Christ and dying is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that is fruitful labor for me, etc. But I don't know which I prefer.
Yeah.
Is he contemplating death, suicide?
I don't think suicide, but that may be my strong kind of 21st century hope that he's not thinking about suicide. I know some scholars have thought he is. He's in dire circumstances of some sort, and it's very hard because what's our trajectory? How many years have we got between the earliest Pauline letter and the latest, generously speaking?
Well, the earliest is probably 1 Thessalonians, and it may be 48.
48, the last is early 60s.
60s, yeah.
So this is not a 50-year development. This is not early Bart to late Bart, to stick with my earlier. But there do seem to be some shifts in Paul's thinking as he goes along, and I would think Philippians is relatively late 1 Thessalonians is clearly very early. And at that point, it's very clear to him, I think, in 1 Thessalonians, in his early ministry, it's very clear to him that, one, that Christ will return, and second, he'll be there when that happens. He'll be alive. He'll be among those who greet the returning Christ. Here it seems to me like he's beginning to think about the fact that the mission may continue beyond his death, and he's thinking about what it will mean for him to be able to if he's to die, what does that mean? And in some ways meditate on something he meditates on very seldom, which is what happens at the moment that we die. Do we simply go to sleep and wait for Christ? Does he come again? A lot of ink spilt on that question. At this point, I think, he shows his clear confidence that he will be Christ's whether he lives or whether he dies. And I take that as not just being rhetorical. That he thinks that at death he will be united with his Lord, but he kind of likes what he's doing too. He's in favor of his own ministry.
And I think some people have cited that passage as supportive of the notion that Paul was in his final imprisonment in Rome.
Yeah, I don't think you need that.
I don't think so.
No,
and he talks about being under the threat of death.
Yeah, no, I don't think
in
you
prison
need to
in Ephesus. Yeah,
that
in
specific about it.
Right, but you're right. He's certainly thinking about his end in a way
that
we
he is
haven't
not
seen
early in his career.
In some of the earlier letters.
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
There's also a theme of joy that he sounds here, and that's one of these other things that links the beginning of the letter to the end.
Very much so.
The end. And here he's rejoicing in the proclamation of Christ, even by people who don't do it his way.
And rejoicing in the fact that, and this is I'm sure a psychologist would have a good way of explaining all this. I know it looks like I'm in prison, but this is really working out very well. Contrary to what looks like the evident facts, this is added to the spreading of the gospel. People note that I'm in jail. The people around here have paid attention to my gospel, and this what looks like bad news may in fact be just furtherance of the good news, which I think is a strong statement of faith as well as kind of a not exactly wishful thinking, hopeful thinking.
And he's saying this both about himself and about them. Right? That whatever they're undergoing is somehow sharing in what it is to be in Christ. So Paul often uses this language of being in Christ.
Yes.
Right? And it has a variety.
It has a variety. In part, it means being in a relationship to Christ. Sometimes it's kind of shorthand for the church. I think those of us who are in Christ, those who are believers. But I think in this case, for both him and for the Philippians, it means being able to share in the tribulations of Christ. We don't have much sense of what it is they're worried about, what the persecution here is like. But there's something troubling them, and he's concerned about that.
Do you think it might have something to do with their relationship with the Roman imperial?
I think it might be. I think it's possible that they're having to make choices between the lordship of Christ, to which we'll turn very seriously in chapter 2, and the other lords, and there may be a price to pay for that, and that they're worried about that.
Right.
Well, let's see where he goes next when he takes this all on with a great hymn.
Okay.